So, Rob, we're delighted to be here today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you're here. Thank you, Darryl.
The audience is excited to hear about your views on the global economy. We'll talk a little bit about Texas, and we'll talk about U.S.
Okay.
I got about 5 or 6 questions, and then we'll open it up for the audience to kind of fire away. So let's just jump right into. Let's talk about the U.S. economy.
Right.
So if you just took us on a walk around the U.S. economy, can you share with us, Rob, your perspective on the things that might be tailwinds that'll fuel the continued growth, and maybe some headwinds that might derail the U.S. economic growth?
And we had a little bit of conversation about this last night, but so for those who were there, this will be a little bit of a repeat. But we believe at the Dallas Fed, our forecast for U.S. GDP growth for 2018 will be approximately 3%. So we think GDP growth this year is going to be approximately 3%. Okay, that's real GDP growth. So this is going to be a very strong year. We think based on this level of growth, we think the unemployment rate is going to slip. Right now it's 3.9%. We think it will go lower. We are already, we have jobs report today, and we think we've got a very tight labor market. And the thing I look at to describe that labor market is, yes, the headline unemployment rate, but the thing I really look at is the thing called in the lingo U6. Can you hear me okay? U6, which is unemployed plus discouraged workers plus people working part-time who in a better economy would rather work full-time. That number, or that percentage, is 7.4%. So a much higher percentage, but to put that in historical context, that far exceeds the pre-recession low on that figure, okay? So that is the one I watch most closely for labor. So like it tells me, it confirms to me that we've got a very tight labor market, and that measure continues to decline. We're also meeting our 2% inflation target. Inflation, we believe, is running already around 2%. So that's the good news. We think a big part of the reason for the healthy growth this year, though, is we've had recently a very substantial fiscal stimulus in the United States late in the economic cycle. And that consisted of 2 parts. Obviously, the tax legislation, which we all know about, but in addition, the recent budget agreement that we just did was also pretty substantial and a pretty significant stimulus. It's our judgment, based on our analysis of the Dallas Fed, that fiscal stimulus, the effect of it is probably at its height this year. It will start to fade in 19. It will fade further in 20. And our own forecast, which might alarm some of you, is that GDP growth by the end of 2020 or into 2021 is going to be in the neighborhood, we believe, back at what we consider potential GDP, which is about 1.75% to 2%. Okay? Now, why is that? What's the reason that we don't think we can sustain this level of growth? We think it may weaken. The reason is the fiscal stimulus will fade, and there's going to be 2 or 3 other things that we're going to have to deal with. Number one, GDP is made up of growth in the workforce plus growth in productivity. Those 2 things added together equals GDP growth. Workforce growth in this country is slowing because our population is aging. We believe the bulk of the decline in the participation rate in this country is due to demographics. It's due to aging, okay? I mean, people are retiring out of the workforce. And we think that trend is going to continue to the point where the participation rate in the United States was 66% in 07, i.e. 18 to 64-year-olds that were members of the workforce. It's 62.7 as we sit here right now today, and we think it's going to slip below 61% in the next 10 years, mainly due to aging, to demographics. So we've got a headwind on that. We've had this headwind before in our history. This is why finding ways to get underrepresented groups back into the workforce, including people on disability back into the workforce. Yes, as sensitive it is, immigration policy, which we can talk about in the Q&A, that's an element of workforce growth. But we've got a challenge in this country how to grow the workforce. By the way, it makes you feel better. Almost every Western nation has the same challenge. Second headwind is sluggish productivity. And we believe the primary reason, while most industries that I follow, and I'm a corporate person, dealt with companies for the last 30 years, most industries I deal with are far more productive than they were 10 years ago. But we measure productivity workforce-wide, okay? And there are 46 million workers in this country that have a high school education or less, okay? If you've got a college education in this country, your unemployment rate is extremely low, 2 and a fraction, and the participation rate is very high. And with technology-enabled disruption, it might create some stress and pain, but you've got the skills to adapt to it. For the 46 million workers with high school education or less, our thesis is you're likely finding your job either being restructured or eliminated. And unless you get retrained, which is easier to say and but harder to do at a certain stage of your life, you're probably going to find a job in a tight labor market, but your productivity may well diminish, okay? And so we think productivity growth is going to be sluggish for a good reason. We believe part of the solution is improved math, science, and reading skills in this country. We rank 25th out of 35 OECD countries in this. We have allowed our skills to erode and improve skills training, which means, pipe fitter, registered nurses, oil field service workers. So we need more skills training to fill all these jobs that are open. So those are 2 drivers. The third driver, which we're concerned about, the fiscal stimulus, I said, is a big tailwind right now. The problem is government debt to GDP is about 76%, okay? And the present value of unfunded entitlements is about $54 billion now. While we've just increased our leverage late in the cycle, which is allowing us to grow faster, as this fades, our concern is in the medium term, if we start trying to moderate debt growth in the United States, which we think we were going to need to face this, this tailwind could become a headwind. So those are 3 reasons why we're concerned that out-year growth is going to be not a recession. I think the household sector is in good shape. We're just saying we're going to be slower than we are now, except we're going to be more highly leveraged. And the reason we like to call these things out at the Dallas Fed, there are structural things we can do to address every one of these issues. But first we've got to talk about them and identify them. And also as a central banker, the fact that out-year growth looks more sluggish is something that gives me some pause in thinking through how quickly we should be raising rates and the stance of monetary policy. It's a factor in our thinking.
No, perfect. So if you just replace global with U.S. to the previous question I asked, give us the same sort of commentary and your thoughts. So to break up the world, the good news over the last year is global growth's been better than we expected, except Europe has the same demographic issues that we do. And this productivity problem I've talked about varies by country, but to some extent is a worldwide issue. And you've got to remember that European growth has been heavily bolstered also by monetary policy, particularly the European Central Bank, that not only buys government debt, but also has bought sizable amounts of corporate debt, okay? So I would say the outlook for Europe is, again, I would expect growth to be somewhat sluggish. Then you've got, Mexico actually has much better demographics than the United States, less of an aging problem. But obviously there are a whole series of issues with a number of the Latin American countries, particularly if they are very exposed to dollar-denominated debt. Then you go to Asia, and you've got to start with China. China has been supplying a substantial percentage of global growth over the last number of years, except the way they've created that 6.5% growth is to increase their debt to GDP substantially. So they tend to have GDP targets, usually 6.5%, and they fill in with infrastructure spending on capacity at state-owned enterprises. And so we think the world's going to have to get accustomed to lower levels of growth from China because we don't think they can keep using leverage
to stimulate their growth. Other emerging market countries have great prospects, and obviously this is a stressful time right now with a stronger dollar, some of the trade tensions and others, and so we're watching this emerging market situation very, very carefully. I would just last comment, we believe the situation of Turkey and Argentina, it's not a surprise that those are the most prominent of the issues, because if you do the analysis, you'll notice they have the largest percentage of dollar-denominated debt versus their current account. So it's not a surprise that those are coming up first. Our hope is that this will be contained and should not spread, because many other emerging market countries don't have these same vulnerabilities. Having said that, they're more fragile, these countries, than are the United States, so we're watching this very carefully. So I don't know that we're going to get the tailwind from global growth that we've been getting, and we'll just have to watch this carefully.
So take it a little step further. We start to talk about global trade. So we can't be in this room and not talk about U.S., Canada, Mexico.
Right.
And then the last part of it is give us your thoughts on China and how that'll play out.
So we do a lot of work at the Dallas Fed. We do a lot of work on energy, by the way, which is why we're having this conference with Kansas City. And we have a big group, and this experience with you all is central to our learning, which is why we appreciate you all being here. We also do a lot of research here, though, on trade. Why? Texas is the largest exporting state in the United States, and so we should have great insight into trade. And we've been pretty vocal at the Dallas Fed in saying that we think the U.S. would be much better served to be segmenting its trading relationships when it thinks strategically. What do I mean by that? The trading relationship with Mexico and to a great extent Canada are what we refer to as intermediate goods relationships. What do I mean by that? 70% of the imports to the United States from Mexico, 70% are intermediate goods. Not final goods, intermediate goods. What do I mean by intermediate good? It's goods going back and forth across the border between the US and Mexico. A lot of the imports from Mexico have US content in them because they're part of very sophisticated logistics and supply chain arrangements which have been developed over many, many years. And our research, at least at the Dallas Fed, suggests that those intermediate goods relationships have allowed US companies to be more globally competitive, keep plants here, add jobs here. And if we didn't have these intermediate good relationships, we would likely in North America lose share elsewhere in the world, most likely to Asia. Okay, so we've been very hopeful, yes, let's modernize NAFTA, let's upgrade these arrangements, but having these deals done is essential, we think, to North American competitiveness, and we feel strongly we should be thinking of North America as a competitive hemisphere in the same way Europe does, in the same way Asia does. So we differentiate that, and it's for these reasons I mentioned this last night. We're quite hopeful, and I'm very hopeful, that in fact the agreements with Mexico and Canada, yes, will get done because it's so clearly in the interest of the United States. And it's not enough to add a job in the US unless it's globally competitive, or the job won't sustain. It'll eventually get competed out of existence. These intermediate good relationships allowed US companies to be at the cutting edge, world class, and add jobs here and improve our competitiveness. The trading relationship with China, we think, is dramatically different. It is the deficit, first of all, is almost completely a final goods deficit, okay? And in addition, we don't think the deficit is the biggest of the issues. Intellectual property rights and technology transfer are the two big issues. And I used to live in Asia, and for any company and we go over there regularly, anyone that's gone over there knows if you want to do a joint venture there, you're going to have to share technology and intellectual property rights, and Chinese companies, they're rapidly building domestic capabilities, which they are then using to compete globally. And so I'm optimistic, and we believe the issues with Europe and in this hemisphere on NAFTA should get resolved here in the near future, and I'd be hopeful that they will. It would not surprise us if the issues with China, on the other hand, take a while. And by the way, if there's a fight to be had, we think that's the right fight. but it would be easier to fight that fight if strategically we've already resolved these other issues in our hemisphere and with our European allies. But I think I for one, you could debate the tactics, and I clearly won't get into those about do you widen tariffs and all those other things. But although I'll make one comment on it in a second about the impact on the economy, but is it surprise us that that's a fight that could go on for months or years? No. Will it be resolved quickly? Not sure, not necessarily. Do we think it's appropriate to be having this battle? Is this a tough negotiation? Probably, in terms of U.S. competitiveness. The good news is, though, setting all that aside, if we stop right now, while tariffs no doubt are affecting individual industries, and I know a number of you in this audience can explain to me how it's affecting you on steel and aluminum, for example, pipeline capacity and other things you're doing. In terms of the overall U.S. economy, the impact has been modest. If it widens out, though, to more goods or goes on longer, we'll obviously reserve the right to revisit that, and we will revisit it. But so far, we'd say the impact is actually, as an economy-wide, is manageable. For certain industries, not very manageable at all, but in terms of the overall economy, we believe manageable.
Yep, and just to follow up on those impacted industries, just expound a little bit on those that are most severely impacted, and then maybe some unintended consequences.
Sure. So we'll take the more, we call them the direct impacts and the second. The obvious impacts are they're steel producers and aluminum producers, and they're steel and aluminum consumers. And as much has been made of the fact, and we've talked about this, there's a lot more consumers than there are producers, and so the effect of higher prices for steel and aluminum is very widespread and is creating hardships across lots of different industries. There's another example, the agricultural impact. You may have noticed, I think it was in second quarter GDP growth, you had a big bump for soybean shipments. Why is that? Because there was a lot more soybeans shipped in anticipation of these tariffs. We think shipments of soybeans are going to be very quiet in the third quarter. So if you're in one of those agricultural industries, this is creating real challenges for you. And there are certain industries that we've talked to where I don't think we intended or the policymakers intended for those industries to be affected, or it wasn't realized there's certain finishing processes that are done in other countries, including China, by the way, where we then bring the goods back here, and these people are trying to figure out how they're going to survive and do business. The other effects, though, I think are a little less obvious. The second and third order effects, I think, are the ones I'm watching in particular. One, there's no question, almost every CEO I talk to, and I talk to about 30 a month, and we do broad surveys, this is having somewhat of a chilling effect on CapEx, we believe. And it's not that people say, I'm not going to spend the CapEx. They're saying, let's just wait a little longer, because if this spreads, I might wish we had made a different decision. So I think it's having some chilling effect on CapEx. And secondly, I mentioned emerging markets. We know we've got a strong dollar. That puts strains on some emerging market countries. So you can get into why is the dollar strong. One is what the Fed is doing. Another is we've got a very strong economy. And the third is the tariffs and the threat of tariffs has some pretty significant effect on currencies, okay? Especially non-dollar currencies, which in a number of different countries creates a lot of strain, especially if they have dollar-denominated debt or they're worried about capital outflows. And this tariff threat and sort of the tensions from it, we think are one of several reasons why emerging markets right now are a lot more fragile. And then that feeds back into where we started earlier in talking about demand for energy, for example. Emerging market, a lot of the growth in the world over the next 20 years is going to come from emerging markets. US is less than 5% of the world's population. Global growth is good for the United States. It's an opportunity for us. And so we have a shared interest in minimizing spillover effects if there's global instability in terms of tightening financial conditions in other countries may ultimately feed back into tightening conditions here. And ultimately, we have a better chance to grow faster if the world is doing better. So this is just a balance that we're watching very carefully here as we go through this process.
Oh, perfect. Just a little bit closer to home. I want to talk a little bit about the regional economy,
Yes.
Texas, and energy.
Yes.
And what's your view on where oil price is going to go? I know we spent a lot of time this morning, but I'm sure everybody's kind of waiting for your thoughts.
So the one thing I was saying to Ed, half kiddingly, is so if for those who read what we write here at the Dallas Fed, the first thing we say, and we say in every speech and in every essay, is the only thing you know for sure about prices is they're going to be volatile. Okay, so no, you're never going to hear somebody at the Dallas Fed say anything about stability. Is not a word that we use, but we talk a lot about volatility. But we'll come back to that in a second. Let me talk about Texas. This story, the Texas story, is a little bit more of a straightforward story in that I talked about aging demographics, slowing workforce growth in the country. Texas is bucking that trend. And the reason is migration of people and firms to the state. One of the things that's going on in the United States, which hadn't been talked about as much, if the population's aging and workforce growth is slowing, it is putting real strains on cities and states. And then you've got another trend, people want to work and live in cities, and young people leaving urban areas, or rural areas, pardon me. And so what's happening, I get a heat map every 6 weeks, based on census data and work that's done by Rice and SMU, and you'll see 35, 40 states in the United States, populations are flat to down, okay? Handful of states have populations going up. Texas is one of those states, okay? A lot of it is because of migration of people and firms to the state. So our population here was 22 and a fraction 10 years ago. It's pushing up closer to 29 right now, and we believe, based on estimates and forecasts, over the next 16 to 24 years, that's a big range, we think population here is going to reach or exceed 40 million people, okay? But if you're a city or a state or a country, you want to grow GDP, population growth is where you start, and workforce growth, and Texas has got that. We've got a number of other challenges, which I'll mention, including improving our education system, improving skills, math, science, and reading. We talked about nationally. We've got that issue in a big way here. But job growth for the state of Texas through 7 months annualized has been about 3.5%, 3.6%. That's job growth. GDP is something higher than that. We think we'll end the year conservatively with 3% job growth in the state of Texas this year, which means GDP growth will be something bigger than that. So Texas is doing very well. We've got a number of challenges: infrastructure, improving education, and I could rattle a lot of these things off. But the reality is the headline for Texas is much more diversified state. Energy, as important as it is down to approximately 9% plus or minus of GDP of the state. Much smaller than it would have been 20, 30 years ago. And a lot of the reason for the diversification is migration of people and firms to this state. But I'd say that if you had a hand to play in the United States, Texas would be right at the top of the list in states you'd want to bet on. But again, a lot of this is population related. In terms of oil, we talked about in the beginning, we still believe, and our research suggests, and based on EIA and others, global supply demand, we think, is in rough balance. And we've called it in our essays a fragile equilibrium. We expect a lot of price volatility, but ultimately, we believe shale is going to be challenged to keep up with the growth in global demand. Now, obviously, global demand can change, particularly based on health of emerging markets, which is critical. But based on our base case, it's our judgment that as prolific as shale is, a lot of the challenges that you've just been talking about this morning are going to mean it's going to be challenging for at least shale growth to keep up with changes in global demand. Then there's what other countries do. There's geopolitical risks and outages. Luckily, at the Dallas Fed, our job is not to predict, nor even if we wanted to, I wouldn't try to predict prices, but it is to try to figure out what the global supply-demand dynamics are, because we have a dual mandate, full employment and price stability, and those dynamics have a big impact on that dual mandate.
Great. So not everybody in the room understands the role of the Fed. You got a lot of industry people, but why don't you just give a little insight, Rob, as to what's your job and what's the process that you follow?
A lot of people at the Fed are asking that. No.
And then how do events like this feed into how you shape your...
So there's 12 regional banks in the United States. Kansas City is one of those regions. Dallas is another region. And we name the regions based on the city where the main office is, but the fact is Kansas City is a very big geographic region and has branch offices in Oklahoma City, Denver, and same for the 11th district, which is all of Texas, parts of New Mexico, parts of Louisiana, and branches throughout Houston, San Antonio, El Paso. So what do we do at the Fed? We have about 1,300 employees, and this would be true for most of the Federal Reserve banks. We have a big supervision staff, hundreds of people that are overseeing the banks in this district, okay? Number two, we oversee Fed-wide treasury services as well as payment services in the United States. If you do a wire transfer or electronic transfer, we're an operator in that system, and we also oversee nationwide, and I actually sit with Esther George, who runs Kansas City, and Loretta Mester. The three of us sit on a nationwide committee to oversee all payments in the United States. We have a big community outreach effort, and we are very active in issues relating to early childhood literacy, the digital divide, access to financial services, improving college readiness, and every Fed bank does that. And then the thing we're most known for is we have a very big research department, as does every other Fed bank. And the Federal Open Market Committee meets formally 8 times a year. Okay, so every 6 weeks, basically, I go to DC, so do all the other Fed presidents. We then sit down with Jay Powell, the other governors, that we as a group form the Federal Open Market Committee. Spend several weeks getting ready, and Mark Giannone, who you just heard from, he leads the effort to help get me ready. And when we go to DC, you have a meeting, usually have committee meetings on Monday. You have the first day of the Federal Open Market Committee Tuesday, which is each of us talks for about 10, 15 minutes about economic conditions in the United States, anything we want to talk about that we think is relevant to the group. So I get a great update from everybody's views, and we all go there and add insight to that. We meet, we then break at the end of that day, have dinner together. We then meet on Wednesday, and each of us does the same drill, goes around the table and gives our views on monetary policy. Chairperson always goes last, first Janet Yellen and now Jay Powell. And then in the last 13 seconds of the meeting, basically we vote. So by the time you get to that point, we know what we're going to do because we've debated it out. But that's the Federal Open Market Committee. And each of the regional Fed banks brings insights in their district. For us, we also bring insights in energy, trade, immigration, and we all share our views on economic conditions in the United States and globally, and our views on monetary policy. And this structure was set up originally, I guess, 1913 and ratified in 1935. And I've only been at the Fed 3 years, so I'm not a career Fed person. But I would say I get now, being on the inside, how this works and why this regional structure is very, very effective. And that between all of us collectively, there's a real team effort and a group effort at the Federal Open Market Committee. By the time you leave that meeting, you've got great insight into economic conditions in the United States, by region, globally. And I think the process works. And by the way, there is no hierarchy. There's no trying to make a good. You're basically, if you disagree with someone around the table, no matter who they are, the chair, you're going to get confronted. If they disagree with me, I'm going to get confronted, and vice versa. So I see the process works in a very apolitical way, and I think it's a good process, I think, to make very good decisions.
And the last question, but how do forums like this and the importance of the exchange, how does it help shape and inform you?
So and I mentioned this at the introduction, it's essential. Every Fed bank, we have approximately 30 PhD economists just at the Dallas Fed in our region, okay? Most Fed banks have the same. And that is enormously valuable. Plus we consult with, and I get views if I see somebody on television or a renowned academic or someone who has, we'll call them and I'll start talking to them once a month. And so we have access to everyone. But I think as valuable is we do surveys with mid-size, big businesses. I mentioned I talk to 30 CEOs a month. I think I'm not unusual among Fed presidents. Conferences like this, when I say to you, we really want to learn from you, that's just not an idle comment. We will learn and get your insight, and then we take all our research processes and our insight we get from people in the industry and outsiders outside the Fed, and we take all that and put it together to form our view. And I think in periods, and I'm a strong believer, some of you may read what I write, I think technology and globalization and other trends have dramatically changed the structure of the US and the global economy. And when you've got a period like that where the structure of the economy, I think, is changing, conversations with context in business are as or more valuable as models, because sometimes the models need to be updated or they're based on historical data. And a world that's changing, our insight and time we spend with you is, it's essential. It's irreplaceable. And I think it's one of the great distinctive things that the Fed does that help us make better decisions and do better analysis.
Perfect. So I'd say we open it up to the audience, and please step up to the mic and state your name and your question.
All right, here, good.
Hi, I'm Walt Duncan from Oklahoma City. I've heard described AI as if an alien space force was going to come descend on the United States in 25 years. What will we do to prepare for it? And so I thought I'd get your comments on that.
So I would say if there was an alien space force coming, it's already descended. In that I believe, and we're so used to it, we forget how different things were 10 years ago. But the fact is, before we even get to everything AI will do, which is already being used, the consumer in this country and all of us now have in the palm of our hands as much computing power as most companies did 20 years ago, okay? That is a dramatic change and has affected the power relationship. When I grew up in business, I was taught companies had much more, there was an information asymmetry and a power asymmetry between the company and the customer. That asymmetry has been flattened and maybe reversed in some cases, where now the consumer has very good transparency and the ability to use technology. And what's happening is established businesses are being increasingly disrupted by technology-enabled competitors that may make unless they adapt, it literally commoditizes their business. Things that were not commoditized are rapidly being commoditized. The way companies are dealing with this is they are actively saying, we need to invest more in technology and basically cannibalize or disrupt ourselves, or we're going to get disrupted. And increasingly, the reason you're seeing a record level of merger activity, in my view, is people are saying, to avoid all that technology investment, I need more scale. Okay? What's increasingly happened, though, which is what in particular I'm interested in, back to your AI point, again, if you're highly educated, I think you're probably on the receiving end of the benefits of AI and this technology investment. The better educated you are, I think studies have shown you're better able to take advantage of this and adapt to it. Again, if you are not highly educated or highly skilled, increasingly you're finding your job is being eliminated. If you work in a call center in the United States, which there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of call centers, those jobs everybody in the industry who runs one tells me it's very possible much fewer of those jobs are going to exist 5 or 10 years from now. They're going to be replaced by technology. And so I think our education system is not keeping up with helping to train and retrain those people to adapt. I think artificial intelligence is going to be more accessible broadly, but I don't think it's going to change the fact that jobs that are high value added jobs today, many of them are going to get disrupted out of existence or become commoditized. And I think our education system probably is going to need to get restructured and make some changes, which are not going to be easy, by the way, to try to adapt to this. And we've got to dramatically, which we are, beef up skills training, because middle skills, which are a big part of jobs in this country, about 45% of all jobs referred to as middle skills jobs, they require a lot more training today than they did 10 years ago. But a lot of it is technology. So the last comment I'll make, I like this example, everybody here's bought a car at a dealer, right? So 10 years ago, you bought a car at a dealer, you probably negotiated with a salesperson, right? And negotiated, frustrating, okay, today, no. You go online, most sales are done online. Even if you go into the dealership, you've done all the work and shopping online. Salesperson is not a very important position. Used to be the highest paid person in the car dealer. Today, that job's been commoditized, maybe out of existence. The person you didn't deal with as much, the automotive technician, that now is the highest paid person in the auto dealership. And there's a shortage of them in the United States because if you damage your car now, with all the electronics, the cost of repair is gone like this, and that job probably makes $150,000, $175,000 a year. Okay, so that's you give me an industry, I'll give you a story like that. This is dramatic change, and this is why you're seeing most auto dealers merge, and you're seeing a lot of consolidation in the industry, because to invest in the technology and deal with this, they need more scale. But every industry is dealing with this, and I think businesses, I don't have a concern that business leaders will figure out how to deal with this. They already are. What I am concerned is the less educated workforce that are on the receiving end and getting buffeted around by this. There's an opportunity cost in terms of GDP growth by not improving our ability to help the workforce become more adaptable. And that's what as a central banker, that's the issue I'm worried about. Yes, sir.
So building on your last remarks, do you have any thoughts? My name's Stephen Hendrickson. I'm an analyst at the Department of Energy. Do you have any thoughts with regard to low-cost natural gas and ethane and the impact that might have on domestic petrochemical, high value-add manufacturing in the U.S., both sort of short-term and long-term?
On this one, I'm going to defer to people in the industry who've got very sophisticated views on this subject, but the only thing I would say is we are blessed in this country. So there's a lot of challenges we have, but one of the things we're blessed with is natural resources, and we're continuing to improve that. And I would guess, and we've got a number of petrochemical leaders on our boards. I think these resources are naturally improving the competitiveness of U.S. domiciled companies, and I think it's a great opportunity for the United States. The tactics of it and the strategies and everything else, I'll probably defer to people in the industry to go through in a more articulate way than I would.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Diesel with Tieton Capital Management. Two questions. First of all, we have a low unemployment rate, and yet other than isolated pockets, energy industry in particular, wage growth has not been commensurate with what we would assume would be the case. Would you please address your view of that topic? And then broadly, cryptocurrencies, what is your and/or the Fed's view on this just evolving
Sure. So
arena?
let me start with, we've been expecting, based on all the discussion with our contacts, that wage pressures are building. But the only comment I'd make, there's two conflicting forces. There's the cyclical wage pressure, which means tight labor market. And I gotta tell you, and you all must hear, everywhere we go in this state, and when I go to the FOMC, I hear from every district, we can't find workers. We can't find skilled workers. Half of all small businesses in this country say they cannot fill skilled jobs. And in addition, we hear even at the lower end, $10, $12 an hour jobs, unless we raise our wages, even if we do raise it, we just can't find people, okay? So with all those anecdotes, why aren't you seeing more wage pressure? I think this is where aggregate data, for me, is not so useful. If you disaggregate it, I think you'd find you're seeing lots of wage pressure for skilled and at the low end. In the middle, though, okay? And I hear this when I'm talking to CEOs in the middle. If you're making $55,000 a year at a company with benefits, I don't know that that's a valuable job. I don't know that you're seeing undue wage pressure in the middle, okay? And so I still believe, and then lastly, automation, which we just talked about, and the fact that in 5 years you may be losing your job because it's going to get restructured or eliminated. And I know in some cities and states, I've heard stories from people I talked to how the unions have intervened and said, listen, we're going to work with you because we don't want to lose this plant or we don't want to lose this job. But that's a threat of technology, much more than globalization, by the way. And so when you wrap it all together, the cyclical pressures are building, and I think you're going to continue to see wage pressure. The structural forces of automation and to some extent globalization are putting a damper, particularly for middle skills jobs, okay? And I think that's probably why you've seen wage pressure be a little bit more muted in aggregate, but I don't think that's to say there isn't wage pressure. I think there is wage pressure, and I think it's building. Cryptocurrency, okay, that's the question. So cryptocurrencies are going to continue to grow, and then things related to blockchain, distributed ledgers, there's no question. You're going to see innovation, and the only thing I know for sure, how the payment system is going to evolve, and I spent a lot of time on this, the only thing I know for sure is I don't think we can predict how it's going to evolve. It's going to look different than it does today. There's going to be a lot of disintermediation. Now, the only caution I'd make on cryptocurrencies is one of the reasons, not the only, one of the reasons for the growth is anonymity, okay? And so that's a caution in that and my guess is that may engender some type of oversight, regulatory response. For those who are bankers, we've got a few bankers in this audience. We have very stringent rules at the Fed on anti-money laundering, know your customer. Cryptocurrencies have been a way around that. So I think that's a caution for, my guess is in the years to come as this grows, there's going to be need for regulations, et cetera, to create a little more transparency about the identity of who's transacting. So we'll see how that all plays out. Yeah, sorry, you were going to get with this gentleman here.
You talk about training and workers, but what type of job do you think the universities are doing in turning out the kind of workforce that we need, and the cost of college education?
Yeah.
It's a big problem.
So let's go through the whole ecosystem. And it starts with early childhood before 5 years old, before first grade. And what we're finding in the state of Texas, but I think this is true to nationwide, among the fastest growing demographics groups, which are blacks and Hispanics, a unacceptably high percentage are starting first grade behind reading level. They're not being read to. All the studies that I've seen suggest if you start first grade and you're not at reading level, you never catch up. I don't care how good the school is, you're not going to catch up. So first thing we say at the Dallas Fed, we've got to start with programs pre-K, 0 to 5, reading to kids during their lunch hour or at home. And this is probably not this may be business, nonprofits working together, okay? I used to read to a child during his lunch hour for years when I was in business, and I took 150 people from my firm once a week with me. I think we've got to do more of that. Then obviously we've got to improve secondary education, okay? And there's a whole series of issues, and I'm part of, there's an effort here. Commit, you may have heard of, but there's lots of them in this country. By the time somebody gets to college, what strikes me, I'll give you the statistics in Texas. A shockingly high percentage of students in the state of Texas are not finishing college even in 6 years, okay? And so it tells you either there's something wrong with the pipeline, or some of those people might have been better off if they had gone into middle skills training or other training, and they would have gotten great middle class jobs, And so we talk a lot about student debt in this country. It's a problem, but everything I've seen says if you graduate, it's a manageable problem, but if you finish and go 6 years and you don't graduate, it's a terrible problem because you don't get much credit for going and not finishing. So our view at the Dallas Fed, there's a whole ecosystem starting with 0 to 5 all the way up the chain, which ultimately improve college readiness or make clear there are other options other than college. I don't think the issue is that colleges aren't doing a good enough job. I think the problem, this is my view, but maybe I'm saying this because I used to be a university professor for 10 years, but I don't think so. But I think there's a problem with the pipeline getting to college where too many students are going and they're not ready. And I'm not sure what the college could do about that exactly to improve graduation rates. I think we've got to work, on the pre-college readiness. And this is a big job. And why is it so hard? Got to be done locally. Okay? So this has got to be done in lots of cities and towns and states all through this country. And right now, from what I can see, it's very uneven in terms of the quality of the progress. But it means higher GDP if we can get this right. So that's what's worth it, obviously, as well as all the other benefits to society. Yes, sir.
I think, final question.
Okay. You've said in recent comments that you're closely monitoring the Treasury yield curve.
Yes.
So assuming that we're on
I
the
am
current
monitoring it.
Yes, but to dig into that a little bit more.
Can't get away from monitoring it.
Yeah. So assuming we're on the current path and we do invert in the next few months, what does that tell you that's different or the same from previous occurrences?
Okay, so let's back up a second. The Fed funds rate right now is 1.75 to 2%. We set a range. Okay, so we're at 1.75 to 2. We were, by the way, in fall of 2015, we were at 0 to 25. So we've made a number of moves. The 10-year Treasury, last I looked in the last hour, 294, 295. All right. We have a little room, in my opinion. I mentioned that I think we should be moving toward neutral. That's my own view in terms of monetary policy. We're already at or past full employment. We're meeting our 2% inflation objective. And that tells me there's not a strong argument for the Fed to be accommodative. Right now, I believe we are still accommodative. I think we should get to neutral, where we're neither accommodative or restrictive. And this is a theoretical judgment, but I think that range is somewhere in the band plus or minus of 2.5 to 2 3/4. So if we raise 3 more times, that would get us to 2.5 to 2 3/4. We'll have to see along the way, and I will be watching carefully along the way, what the 10-year is doing. But if the 10-year stays where it is or backs up a little bit, at least Fed funds to 10-year, we will not invert. 10 years 295. Okay? But I'll be watching it. More importantly for me, what's the yield curve telling me? I'm a markets person and a markets background. Yield curve is telling me the following. On the short end, the 1s and 2s tells me the 1 and 2 years very accurately, I think, responding to what the Fed has said it's going to do on rates. That helps explain why the 1 year, 2 years, 260s, in that neighborhood, plus or minus. The 10-year, which is market determined, and 30-year tells you a little bit, yes, there's a lot of global liquidity. So because there's so much global liquidity, that may be keeping the long end a little lower than it would be. But it's also, I think, telling you one other thing. Expectations for medium-term growth are sluggish. Okay? If people thought, or if the markets thought this current level of growth was going to sustain, I don't think the 10-year and the 30-year would be at the current levels. I don't. I think the fixed income markets, rightly or wrongly, are at least telling me the market is skeptical about the prospects for out-year growth. I think that's worth paying attention to. The reason I think inversion concerns me, there's a number of reasons. One, it's been historically a very highly reliable forward indicator of future recession. That doesn't mean it will be in the future, by the way. And global liquidity may be distorting that, so I'm aware of that. But the second thing I'm worried about is if you're in an environment as a financial intermediary where you borrow short, you take deposits short, and you lend long and you can't make a spread, that has a behavioral impact on the economy. It doesn't shock me that that has probably that kind of situation. If you had a sizable inversion and prolonged, you could see why that might impede credit growth, because financial intermediaries can't do their normal borrow long and lend, you borrow short and lend long. So I'm watching this very, very carefully. A flat or flattish yield curve, I'm not sure is necessarily alarming. I think if we had a sizable inversion or material inversion and it was extended, I think that's something I've said publicly is would be appropriate for me to take into account and be concerned about. And arguments why this time is different may be right, but I don't have enough confidence in that to say I'm going to not pay close attention to an inversion. I'm hopeful that we can get to neutral without an inversion, but we will have to see, and it will be one of many factors I'll be looking at as we go through this process.
Okay, Rob, we've covered a lot of territory.
All right.
Any closing remarks?
No, I guess my most important remark would be to everybody here. I know you're all pleased to be here and to be invited, but I want to say to you, on behalf of Dallas and Kansas City and the Fed generally, thank you for being here. We hope you'll enjoy this conference. You'll come to future conferences. We need your insight. We need your advice. If you think you've heard something here or something we say doesn't sound right to you, I want to hear that. We are open-minded, and the most important quality, I would say, of an effective Federal Reserve Bank is the ability to learn. And the reason we're glad you're here is we need to learn from you. It's a key part of our job. So thank you for your participation, and thank you for being here.